Hey, this is Trent at CFan Studio, and in this video, we're going to make a chess set out of some old growth black walnut and some white oak scraps. Stick around to see how it all comes together. Now, you might have been thinking that we were going to use the black walnut for the dark squares and the white oak for the light squares. But if you were, you're forgetting how much we love epoxy at CFan Studio. So we cut 4 strips of black walnut to 1 3/4 inch width. We then built a mold, and we used epoxy to make the other 4 strips. So we mixed up 2 batches of epoxy. We added white pigment to one and blue mica powder to the other. Next, we poured the white epoxy in the 4 strips. We then added a drizzle of blue epoxy, adding layers and depth to create a cool 3D effect. Using a heat gun, we then spread the blue epoxy around, giving it a cloudy look. One of my oldest and closest friends owns a cabinetry shop with his dad. Over the years since I've picked up woodworking, they've been incredibly helpful, sharing processes and techniques to help me improve my craft. Since I don't have a thickness planer in my own shop, they've been super generous by giving me access to their 22-inch planer. On the final pass, we got some major tear out in one of the epoxy strips. We're not entirely certain what happened here, but we think it may have been because we mistakenly rotated the piece 180 degrees before sending it through on its final pass. Fortunately, this is an easy fix. I did a light pour of epoxy, spread it all over the strip, and then let the auto leveling properties of the epoxy work its magic. I gave 48 hours for the epoxy to cure, then I used a block plane to remove the bulk of the excess, and finally used the orbital sander to bring it to flush with the rest of the board. I covered the adjacent strip with some blue tape to avoid over sanding it. All of the wood used in this build was gifted to me by those same friends that I mentioned just earlier. The black walnut is some reclaimed wood with a really cool story. It was originally used as wall paneling in a house built in the 1920s. My friend's dad then did a job on that same house in the 1990s, and they had to remove some of this wall paneling for what they were installing. He was able to keep some of that and has held on to it since. With the repair done and the board flat, I'll now cut it into 8 strips. It has been a brutally hot summer here in Texas. So hot that I haven't even been able to run my shop vac while running the saw and other tools in my shop because it just puts off too much heat and becomes overwhelmingly hot in the shop. That's why you see all of these saw shavings just spitting all over me and the shop, because even though I have the hose hooked up there, I don't actually have the shop vac running. I really find it satisfying seeing that checkerboard pattern come together. A principle I like to live by is something I call failing forward. And what this means is anytime I fail at something, I like to look at it and see what I did wrong, what I could have done better, and what I can learn from that experience. That way, next time I encounter that situation, I'll be able to address it in a much better way and hopefully have the success that I'm looking for. This is one of those moments. I realize now that I should have sanded these edges to get rid of those saw blade marks that you see, especially in the epoxy. You'll see how this is a problem in just a minute.
Okay, so I record with my phone, and the shop is so hot right now that the phone got too hot, and I wasn't able to finish recording the glue up process. So I just kind of wanted to show you what the end result was, and I'm sorry for the missed footage, but let me flip this around here. One thing I want to note is in the previous footage that you did see, I had them all stacked up, kind of like you would do a wood glue up, and I had smeared the epoxy all over just one edge. The problem is when I got that down and put them together, the pieces that had the epoxy on the wood did not, it wicked it up, right? So it didn't get much transferred over to the epoxy side. And so as it was starting to cure up, I noticed that some of these pieces were not held together well. So I did another pour of epoxy and I kind of did a flood coat over this. I tried to avoid getting it on the wood too much so I didn't have to sand off a bunch. But I essentially put a little bit on each of the squares and then made sure that it was worked into the edges so that it would make a nice glue up for the whole board. And then I wrapped it with saran wrap, and that's what this texture is that you see here. It's just where it was kind of folded up over it. So yeah, just need to sand it down now, get it back flat. Let's do it.
I set up this form to hold the board in place while I'm sanding, but most importantly, to avoid rounding off the edges with the sander when I'm sanding them. It's not perfect by any means, but it certainly helped. Next, I'll bring the workpiece over to the table saw to clean up the edges. First, I'll trim off two of the edges that are perpendicular to each other, and then I will bring the fence in ever so slightly and trim up the other two edges. Now that the top is in a good spot, it's time to move on to building the base. I want to use the white oak as a trim on the base, so the first thing I need to do is cut 4 strips. If you're still watching at this point, it's probably safe to assume that you're enjoying the content. So I think this is a good time to ask for your subscription. I intend to continue making content like this, and hopefully the production quality will continue to get better. But what's really going to help me grow this channel is people subscribing and continuing to watch the videos. So thank you, and let's get back to it. Now that the strips of white oak have been cut, I need to cut a rabbet in the white oak and in the black walnut that's going to be used for the base. With that done, it's time to glue them together. I absolutely love the way this black walnut looks. It is just beautiful. I'm really glad I get to repurpose this wood and give it a whole new lease on life. Next, I'll use my block plane to make sure these pieces are nice and flat. Now that the strips have a nice flat face to reference, I will use my crosscut sled to cut the miters. Next, I'll do a dry fitting just to make sure everything's lining up nicely. I was really excited seeing this come together until somewhere along the way I had subtracted when I should have added. Now, I'll be the first to admit that initially I was very frustrated with myself over this situation. However, as the plan for a fix started to come together, it really began to feel like one of Bob Ross's happy little accidents. That's the fit I was looking for. This was a real tricky glue up, and I don't have a whole lot of fancy clamps, so I had to get creative with it. I can honestly say I didn't ever think I was going to use my crosscut sled to do a glue up. I think you'll agree that this fix ended up being a really nice aesthetic feature. Now I'll use my router to cut a rabbet in the base. This will make a recess that the playing board can set down in. Here I'm wet sanding the playing board up to 3000 grit to get a mirror finish on the epoxy. I thought a chamfer on the playing board would give it a real nice look. T-coil might not be the finish of choice for a chessboard, but it's the finish I had. Last thing to do is to mix up some resin and make some chess pieces. I really enjoyed making this chess set, and I hope that you enjoyed watching. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button. Oh, and I did add one last feature.